In this chapter, we are discussing one of my favorite topics, obviously, education from the sociological perspective. Before we jump into the specific sociology, I want to give a brief overview of education and how we got to the system we have today. So, from a global perspective, formal institutionalized secular education in Western civilization began in ancient Greece around 8th century BCE. BCE stands for before Common Era. Students study philosophy, math, music, and gymnastics. In the Middle Ages, the church becomes the main educator until about 12th to 13th century. They mainly focused on training students to become priests. Mind you, it was generally men throughout this point in history that were educated. In the 13th century, lay education emerges. Lay refers to someone who's not a member of the clergy or who's not a member of a particular profession. And so education consists of apprentice training for common people or education and chivalry for the more privileged. Universities existed, but they only were reserved for the most privileged members of society, where they offered courses in 3 subjects: law, theology, and medicine. Now, while systems of education have evolved a great deal since the Middle Ages, the roots of what we recognize as modern mass education can be traced back to the idealism of the European Enlightenment of the 18th and 19th centuries. During this period, education greatly increased, as well as the value placed on it. The main thinkers of the day, such as Voltaire, Locke, and Franklin, emphasized knowledge, reason, logic, and science over religious tradition. They believed an educated public was key to the future and well-being of modern society. Specifically looking on the history of US education, it was really the Industrial Revolution that makes free public education possible and compulsory. In the early years of the US, most people worked on farms, and there was no free public education. As industrialization progressed and fewer people made their living from farming, education began to expand and eventually became free and mandatory. After the revolution, we see education emerging more in the northern states rather than the southern states. But by 1918, all states had mandatory education laws. Some other notable decisions we see from 1918 to the 1940s, high schools grow in number and in size. And at the beginning of the 20th century, fewer than 1,000 colleges existed, but explosive growth in the number of colleges occurred due to, in part, the support of wealthy philanthropists such as John Hopkins and Carnegie Mellon and Vanderbilt and Rockefeller, many of these establishing universities in their names. Rejecting liberal calls for large-scale aid to education, in 1944, Congress passed the more conservative program of aid limited to veterans who had served in World War II. The GI Bill made college education possible for millions by paying tuition and living expenses. And the GI Bill, something that still exists today, offering help to veterans. Under Lyndon B. Johnson in the 1960s, the Great Society was a set of policies passed to further expand federal support for education. The Higher Education Act was one of these, set up in 1965, which established federal scholarships and low-interest loans for college students and built 25 to 30 new community colleges a year. And another notable decision in 1972, Mills versus the Board of Ed in the District of Columbia, was a case that was brought on behalf of 7 school-age children with special needs who argued that the school board was denying their access to free public education. Because prior to that time, if a child had special needs, they would typically have to go to a private place for learning, and that cost money. And so they were successfully able to advocate that they should have equal access to free public education as well. So you can see the development of educational achievement in the United States. And we're going to come back to that a few times, how we were in the modern era, one of the more advanced countries to establish universal free education. But let's see where we exist today. First of all, looking from a global perspective, there are differences in a nation's education, right? And it's not only related to the economy, but also to the cultural value placed on it. Differences in the value can be reflected in either the amount of time devoted to education. South Korea devotes 220 days a year, while the US has only 180 days. It could also be measured by the distribution of education. So we're going to look at a couple samples. First, looking at Japan as an example of education that exists in the wealthiest developed nations. Japanese education reflects a group-centered ethic, right? Part of education is to socialize students into the dominant cultural values, and group-centered ethics is important Japanese value. Children in grade school work as a group, mastering the same skills and materials. Cooperation and respect for elders are stressed. College admission procedures are based on test scores only, and only the top scores are admitted, regardless of social class. So this would represent a more meritocratic system, right? We talked about meritocracy in our chapter on social class. However, there's a caveat, and that is children are increasingly receiving extra tutoring at the juku or cram schools, they are known as, and these can cost up to $3,000. If we were to look at education in a poor, developing, low-income nation, we could focus on Egypt, for example. Egypt is an interesting case study. In the developing world, most children do not get an education beyond a few years, either because their families see no reason for it or because they cannot afford it. Several centuries before the birth of Christ, Egypt was a world-renowned center of learning in especially physics, astronomy, geometry, geography, math, philosophy, and medicine. However, over time, education declined. It never rose again to its former prominence. And due to war and global economics, the educational system in Egypt is now among the lowest. Today, the Egyptian constitution makes 5 years of grade school free and compulsory, just 5 years. However, qualified teachers are few, classrooms are crowded, and it's very limiting. As a result, a third of Egyptian men and over half of Egyptian women are illiterate. Those individuals that do receive a formal education attend grade school for 5 years, preparatory school for 3 years, and high school for 3 years. So that was to show you the contrast in educational systems and how much it can vary based on a nation's economy, and culture. Now we're going to look at the US versus selected countries. How does our quality of education compare internationally? Well, the Program for International Student Assessment, called the PISA, is an international test that is administered to 15-year-olds worldwide. Over the last 10 to 20 years, the PISA test has exhibited the decline in education in the US compared to other countries. In 2018, US had placed 25th in rankings for science and math, continuing that descending path. The top scoring countries were Singapore, South Korea, Hong Kong, Japan, and Finland. One analyst from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, also known as OECD, that's the organization that actually created the PISA test and administers it, attributed performance differences and the low rankings of the United States educational system to differences in social background. One journalist from NPR concluded that the US's educational system may be on a descending path that could significantly affect the economy and its social landscape. And this is a map showing worldwide rankings of all countries that administer the PISA test. You could see that most African countries are not included, as well as some Middle East and Southeast Asian countries. Analysts determined some common values among those that have successful educational systems, well-established standards, and clear goals for all students. Many of these nations recruited teachers from the top 5 to 10% of university graduates each year. And in these nations, the teaching profession tends to also be highly valued and highly rewarded. Equitable distribution of resources. So in the top ranking countries, limited access to resources such as one social class did not predict low performance. And then what they called resilient students. These are students that they defined as those who achieve at a higher level than one might expect given their social background. So these are common values among the top scoring countries. Among the top scoring countries, Finland stands out. And it's a very interesting case study to look at. So Finland had once been in the lower rankings of global educational systems. And about 30 to 40 years ago, they undertook radical reform and pulled itself up to the top 5 to 10 in reading, math, and science, beginning in the early 2000s. Now, Finnish education often seems paradoxical to outside observers because it appears to break a lot of the rules we take for granted. Contrary to the rigid curriculum and long hours demanded of students in Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, Finnish children tend to go to school for much less hours and tend to do much less work. It's common for Finnish children to begin formal reading at the age of 7. They have approximately 300 less hours of schooling than the United States, which is already on the lower end compared to Hong Kong, South Korea, for example. Homework load is light. There are no gifted programs in the Finnish education system, almost no private schools, no high stakes national standardized tests. In America, we start standardized tests early and test often. Finland does it once, and it's the international PISA test. Finland prioritizes allocating resources for those who need them the most. They also have smaller class sizes. For example, in a math class, it is common to see no more than 15 students. and they offer more individualized instruction. All teachers have a master's degree at all levels, not just the college level, and all are taken from the top 10%. They also don't test their teachers or ask them to prove their knowledge, but instead invest in a lot of additional teacher training even after they become teachers. And there is a short clip on the Finnish education system, about 10 minutes long, and it's Michael Moore created it, which he's a very controversial figure, but this clip I think is very informative. I did post that on Canvas, and I urge you to watch that. The concept guiding almost every educational reform in Finland and other top scoring countries has been equity. And when you watch that video, you will see they explicitly state that they didn't create any of these ideas. They actually used some of the early American educational pioneer ideas, because again, at one point, our system was among the top globally. So the difference between equality and equity means treating every student the same, that would be equality, or ensuring every student has the support they need to be successful. So, do we value education in the US? We might say so, but what does it look like in reality? First, we can study equity, right? One of the most important concepts. And we do see some good news. The achievement differences between Black and white students and between Hispanic and white students have apparently declined over time. The bad news is that gaps still remain. Dropout rates are highest among Hispanic children. And it is also important to point out that the achievement gaps have been narrowing because Black and Hispanic student scores have been rising faster than those of white students, meaning that there is some general decline going on anyway. The achievement gap between white students and Asian students greatly increased in favor of Asians. By 2013, Asian students scored almost half a standard deviation higher than white students in math. Now, one potential explanation for the racial achievement gaps is that they are largely due to socioeconomic disparities among white, Black, Hispanic, and Asian families. So is it race, is it class? It leads us back to that question William Julius Wilson posed. And this shows you the achievement gaps and standard deviations among the different racial groups and different grade levels. The bad news is that until recently, the achievement gap between higher and lower social class groups appeared to be increasing, particularly between the children in the highest income group and everyone else. This had reversed somewhat due to the 2008 recession, but only slightly. And after post-recession, we saw some increase again in the gaps between the rich and the poor. Between the mid-1990s and 2013, the percentage of all students attending high poverty schools, those are defined as schools with more than 75% of students eligible for free lunch, rose substantially from 2003 to 2013. 43.5% of Black students, 40.3% of Hispanics attended a high poverty school, compared with only about 7% of white or Euro American students and an even lesser percentage of Asian students. Students from low-income families are 4.5 times more likely to drop out in any given year. So there's still immense inequity outcomes between the different social class groups. Value of education could also be measured in funding. And 29 states were still spending less per student in 2015, adjusted for inflation, than they did before the Great Recession. This leaves many public schools dilapidated, overcrowded, and reliant on outdated textbooks and threadbare supplies. This fact, it has become even more exaggerated during the pandemic as many schools went online, and those that were already struggling for resources found it extremely difficult to convert. And there's a whole generation that probably lost a couple years of education because of this. The cost of college specifically has increased since the mid-1980s, at the same time that government support has barely increased. As it becomes more necessary to have a college degree, it is becoming increasingly harder to achieve. And this shows you from 1963 to 2016, the rise in private colleges, public colleges, and community colleges. The good news is that community colleges is still an affordable option. The bad news is that if you were thinking about transferring to a private college, you were going to spend substantially more. And the value can also be measured in how much the culture values teachers, the profession of teaching. The country's roughly 3.2 million full-time public school teachers, K through 12, are experiencing some of the worst wage stagnation of any profession, earning less on average in inflation-adjusted dollars than they did in 1990, according to the Department of Education. As states have tightened the reins on teacher salaries and benefits, they have also enacted new benchmarks for student achievement with corresponding standardized tests, curricula changes, and performance evaluations. The loss of control over classrooms combined with the direct hit to their pocketbooks has been too much for many teachers to bear. That is why we've seen recent protests the last couple of years and walkouts, and we also see substantial teacher shortages, especially in particular areas of the country. Nursing shortages existed in some parts of the US, but that had led to signing bonuses, free housing, tuition reimbursement, and other perks. While the response to the teacher shortages has been to increase class sizes, shorten the school week, and enact emergency certification for people who aren't trained as educators. Do we value education in the US? Now we're going to move to our sociological perspectives on education, and I'm going to briefly run through these, and I want you to spend time reading about each of the theoretical perspectives. So the functionalist perspective, the main idea is education provides social benefits. These are the intended or manifest functions of education system, right? Teaching knowledge, cultural transmission, bestowal of status, social integration, maintaining social control, and agent of change, right? And that's actually a really interesting function from the functionalist perspective. Formal education is associated with openness to new ideas, especially higher education, and critical analysis, stressing the importance of qualifying statements and the need to at least question established truths and practices. And in that way, it could be an agent of change. But also the best indicator of a person's lifetime earnings is still the number of years of formal schooling that person has received. So in effect, it could change the outcome of an individual's success and social mobility. And this is the lifetime earnings by race, gender, and degree. And you can see across the board, there is still an increase in lifetime earnings based on the higher degree you receive. Of course, there's differences based on race and ethnicity. The conflict perspective, the main idea is perpetuating social inequality. So they argue that the educational system rewards upper class individuals who have more cultural capital. That is the cultural knowledge or competencies in language, including knowledge of books, art, music, and other forms of high and popular culture. They are critical of the hidden curriculum. the unwritten rules of behavior that are deemed proper for society and are taught subtly in schools. Sociologist Bowles and Gintis found that schools train students to be future workers for the labor force of a corporate economy instead of training students to critically question their position within the national economy, right? And this is from 1977, a little outdated, but we can apply it to today. How much does critical thinking factor into our education? Conflict theorists are very critical also of tracking. Tracking is a system that places students in certain educational tracks or programs of study, right? So if you had a gifted program or a remedial program in your school, then your school had a tracking system and it would determine the types of classes they take. Now, we could debate tracking. Supporters of tracking believe that students do better in tracked classes because they are with students of similar ability and they have access to more individual attention from teachers. But conflict theorists feel that tracking leads to self-fulfilling prophecies and perpetuates race and class inequality. They argue that if you look at the student demographic makeup of the lower tracks, that they tend to come more from minority groups or lower income families. We see schools not only produce social class inequalities, but those based on gender, and males are channeled more into STEM careers like science, technology, engineering, and math. And those are higher paying careers more often than females are. Continuing segregation and resegregation, schools are still characterized by racial isolation. That is because our neighborhoods, our communities, the places we live tend to be segregated still. This is the consequence of racial discrimination in the housing market historically, but today we also see other issues such as gentrification and cost of living that prevents some groups from moving into better neighborhoods with better school systems. And on that note, we see unequal funding among the different public school systems. And this is because in our country, public schools are largely financed by local property taxes. That makes for rich and poor school districts. This unequal funding already stacks the deck against minorities and the poor. Based on research, family background affects the educational system. Those students, regardless of personal abilities, who come from more well-to-do families are not only more likely to go to college, but also to attend the nation's more elite schools. And this slide is on the resegregation that we see in K-12 systems. 15% of Black and 14% of Hispanic or Latinx students attend schools, while whites make up less than 1% enrollment. And there's also the concept of apartheid schools. In Los Angeles, for example, 30% of Latinx students attend apartheid schools, where 99% of students are students of color. The symbolic interactionist perspective, the main idea is that students will rise to the level of expectations to which they are held, mainly from their teachers. Teachers shape the experiences students have in the classroom, and symbolic interactionists see education as one way. Labeling theory is actively supported. For example, maybe a bad grade or poor performance in class may lead a student to being labeled as a low achiever. Such labels are hard to shake off and can create self-fulfilling stereotype. And this was the case in the Ray Risk research of 1970. This looked at the relationship between social class and academic achievement by focusing on teachers' expectations. The researchers performed participant observation in an African-American grade school with an African-American faculty. The study concluded that each child's journey through school was determined by the 8th day of kindergarten. After 8 days and without testing for ability, teachers divided the class into fast, average, and slow learners. Rist found that social class was the underlying basis for assigning children to different groups. And how did the teachers determine that? Well, they looked at their clothing, they looked at the materials that they brought to class, language, behavior, even family name perhaps. Students from whom more was expected did the best. Students in the slow group disengaged themselves from classroom activities. Therefore, they would side with the conflict perspective, saying that tracking begins with the teacher expectations and that labels applied as early as kindergarten tended to follow the child throughout their entire educational career, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Rosenthal-Jacobson research was conducted 2 years prior to Rist research and actually proved the same idea about labels, the self-fulfilling prophecy. And you could read more about that in the textbook. The feminist perspective, right? Education has roots of gender inequality. There's pressure on women to study traditional women's subjects, although this might be changing. And one way to equalize the gender wage gap would be to encourage women to enter non-traditional careers such as tech, math, engineering, and others. They focus on unequal funding for female athletics, the bias in employment of administration and leadership positions, and despite the fact that women now outnumber men in college commencements in the United States, they seek to promote women's rights to equal education around the globe because nearly 2/3 of the world's illiterate are women. And the postmodern perspective, knowledge is a commodity. Knowledge has become a commodity exchange between producers and consumers. Universities are becoming corporatized, now referred to as the MIC University, and students are now seen as consumers rather than learners. And the rhizomatic model of learning, that refers to knowledge that is increasingly non-hierarchical, open-ended, and involves the wisdom of the crowds, crowdsourcing, if you will. The scholar who created this idea, this concept of the rhizomatic model of learning, said that we're all just sort of nomads searching the web in a random and sporadic manner, and we create meaning and identify what is important to us. So that if this approach becomes the norm in education, a specific curriculum determined by experts may become irrelevant, right? Because we could just peruse the internet for whatever information fits what we believe to be important and meaningful. A variety of factors we've already discussed, but some that we haven't are identified as major problems facing the US educational system today. Grade inflation. It appears that grade inflation has become widespread from high schools to the Ivy League, where teachers used to give about twice as many C's as A's. And grade inflation is so pervasive that 50% of all college freshmen have an overall high school grade of point average of A. How is that possible? And why is that the case? Are teachers pressured to give higher grades? Has the culture evolved? How are parents involved in influencing this? Princeton recently experimented with grade deflation, but ended that after a decade because it wasn't really fixing the issue. And this caused one educator to question the use of grades at all. And I posted a link to that educator's letter that he posted on the internet. discussing his ideas of why grades are dysfunctional and what might be better ways of assessing knowledge. So I urge you to look through that as well. Related to grade inflation is social promotion, passing one student from grade to grade despite their failure to learn any basic materials. And as a result, we see functional illiteracy, where high school graduates who have never mastered things as they should have learned in grade school, high school students that still have difficulty reading and writing, some can't fill out job applications, others can't even figure out whether they get the right change at grocery stores. And related to all that is the increase in mediocrity. This is different than meritocracy, mediocrity, mediocre, right? You can read through the list of examples that show you how there is a promotion of mediocrity in our. We talked about the disparities in funding for K through 12 schools, primarily because funding comes from local property taxes. We also have an explosion in student loan debt that is a major concern among the younger generations, and also, Congress is looking at this issue, and certain congressional leaders, such as Elizabeth Warren, are arguing for full student loan forgiveness. When we look at education, policy analysis is a key aspect to understanding why we have the issues we do have. No Child Left Behind was a policy passed under the Bush Jr. administration, and one of the major critiques was that it increased teaching to the test, because they tied school funding to outcomes on standardized test scores. And so teachers, in order to not lose funding and to not disappoint the school, right, they ended up just teaching to the test. Common Core was established by Obama administration and had the intention to remedy the issues from No Child Left Behind. Unlike No Child Left Behind, which was a federal policy that was imposed on states, No Child Left, or Common Core, is state-led rather than a federal initiative, and states had the choice of whether they wanted to adopt Common Core standards. Although Obama did create a grant incentive program called Race to the Top for states that did adopt these standards. The next step is assessing the results, because there is not yet one set of standardized assessment tools for Common Core. It remains unclear how well the program works. So what are solutions? Well, we need quality teachers. We need to raise standards for teachers. Most are qualified and, if motivated, can do an excellent job. Now, there's certainly a lot of burnout because of the overcrowding and the lack of resources, but many still are motivated because they view it as a calling. But there are a large number of teachers that aren't qualified. Consider what happened in California, where back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, teacher shortages led to increasing teachers that were they were qualified to teach if they passed an educational skills test. The teachers did so poorly that to fill the classrooms, the officials had to drop the passing grade to a 10th grade level. These were college graduates. So we need to raise standards for teachers. We also need to raise standards for students. A study by sociologists Coleman and Hoffer in '87 set out to explain why test scores of students in Catholic schools averaged 15 to 20% higher than those in public schools. Their findings: the superior test performance in verbal and math skills of the students in Catholic schools was not due to better students, but to higher standards. So if teachers expect more from their students, they will get more. The researchers also underscored the importance of parental involvement. A warning about higher standards. Let's be realistic. Teachers aren't miracle workers. There's only so much they can do to address problems that students bring to class every day. The Finnish educational model, we cannot forget, is supported by other aspects of the European social model, which includes 3 years of paid parental leave, subsidized childcare, free medical and dental for all school children. And we also should seek to improve the state of families. Problems begin long before a child steps through the schoolhouse door. And if we raise standards for students, we can expect to upset students and their parents. And you could look at the example of the case of Florida that happened not too long ago. Other solutions, our education system in the United States is flawed, and most of the changes are minute adjustments to the details of a system that needs to be overhauled from top to bottom. And if Finland can do it, hopefully the US can do it. We need to tailor teacher expectations, have more interactive learning, well-established standards with clear goals for all students. We need to recruit teachers from the top percentage of university graduates and pay more to attract and retain talent. We need to focus on equity, have more equitable distribution of resources, and increase overall funding from the federal government to make up for the disparities in local taxes. Reducing class sizes will allow for more teacher interaction. We need to start at home, involving parents, which means that they might have to have a little bit more flexibility in the workplace. And sociologists have found that peer groups are an incredibly important factor in how teens do in school. So teens who hang out with good students tend to do well. Is a college degree still a smart investment? Young Americans are told that a college degree is the best way to prepare for the job market. The usual argument is that even as it has become increasingly expensive, students are investing in themselves. But this investment theory only makes sense if education is producing graduates have skills and knowledge they can turn into higher wages. Sociologist Randall Collins is very critical of the current system and argue that job skills of all sorts are actually acquired in the work situation rather than formal training institution, while college only provides a credential. Now, the credential can be enormously valuable, of course, but it's subject to inflation. As more and more people attend college, jobs that used to require high school diplomas start wanting bachelor's degrees and so on. So today, a bachelor's degree may be becoming equivalent to a high school degree. So is it a bad investment? Many experts say no. Mary Daly, a senior VP at the Federal Reserve Bank, says there's still strong evidence that a college degree still gives people an earnings advantage. Research also shows the benefit of college in terms of higher earnings far outweigh the cost of obtaining a degree. And the Pew Research Center notes a college degree is worth more than ever as the earnings between those without a college degree and those with one continues to widen. However, there are some cracks in the consensus. The most obvious disclaimer is that past returns are no guarantees of future returns. College was a terrific investment in the past, but will that still be true for those applying today? Of course, a lot depends on how much the school costs. A more affordable college may take up to 9 years to break even, but some may take up to 18 years. There is also the question of college major. The annual wages of recent graduates vary widely from 27 grand to 50 grand based on major. And of course, STEM majors pay more than education in the arts or psychology. Nobel Prize winning economist James Heckman believes the value of college depends on the student. Even with those high prices, you're still finding a high return for individuals who are bright and motivated. But those who aren't college ready, then the answer is no, it's not worth it. So there's a lot of diverse opinions out there. Of course, I believe that education in and of itself is of value. Knowledge should always be valued and prioritized. However, because of the costs and the funding, it is a question of how much this will get you, how much more successful will this get you. Meanwhile, high-paying trade jobs sit empty while high school graduates line up for university. And so I posted a link from NPR regarding high-paying trade jobs, and you can look at that in more detail, as well as explore the social policy piece in the textbook about the alternatives to public education, such as charter schools. And that ends our discussion on education.